There's not been a single year since 1914, when Britain declared war on Germany, that the United Kingdom has not been involved in military action somewhere around the world. Most of the time, these activities could not be described as official wars, but rather as something more akin to interventions. In the past 100 years alone, Britain has engaged in intense military interventions in places like Iraq and Korea, as well as embarking on perpetual interventions in the Middle East, Asia and Africa. The reasons provided have ranged wildly, from defending its empire, winning the Cold War, through to defeating international terrorism and even protecting the lives of foreign citizens. But no other country has been so continuously involved in so much military action over such a long period. So what's the public's view? Do they believe the reasons given to them for the military action? And do leaders in the West really respect institutions such as the United Nations? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. And we began by considering the fact that British military force around the world has caused the deaths of thousands and thousands of innocent lives, gently called collateral damage. What's the public's view about that? This is what they said. Britain's military force around the world has led to millions of innocent deaths. How do you feel about this as a resident of the country?
Well, I'd start by challenging the view that Britain's military presence has led to thousands of deaths. I believe that although the use of force has been at times questionable, I think on the whole it has led to a improvement in the international security environment. So I challenge the premise of the question.
In the sense of the deaths, obviously no one likes them, but I think that Britain shouldn't have intervened in some of the places that they have, and I think more so as a resident, my issues with the waste of taxpayers' money and the little results they've achieved.
It's all greediness about oil.
You reckon that's the reason?
Yeah, that's what I think. Why they go to other people's country and bombing up? What? For a reason?
I think that any war, I mean, it's not the ideal situation in any stretch of the imagination. So even if it's a good cause or a cause that you feel like you have to be part of, innocent lives on any side is appalling, devastating and awful.
A range of views, but general concern about the deaths of the innocent in conflict situations. We put the question to our experts. Can this be avoided? How serious is the problem of the deaths of the innocent in military interventions by Britain?
In the debate we're having at the moment about tensions and stress around the world and the role of NATO, I think it's important to understand a bit of British history. This was an enormous colonial power. Half the world was part of the British Empire at one stage. Vast areas of the world were coloured with the sort of strange pink that showed it was part of the British Empire. And the British Empire based itself on slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries, based itself on exploitation of minerals and natural resources around the world and on plantation systems of agriculture. And some quite appalling things were done in the name of the British Empire. And even at the end of the British Empire after the Second World War, colonial wars were fought in Kenya and many other places, and the most brutal methods were used in order to prevent people gaining their independence, even after India had gained its independence. And so I think Britain should be slightly careful about lecturing the rest of the world on these issues, and it's time to divest ourselves of our imperial grandeur and past and look to a world where we make a contribution based on respect, based on justice, based on human rights.
There's competition all over the world. There's competition between countries for markets and so on, and for influence, ultimately to control the amount of or the degree of one country's hegemony over another. There are blocs like the EU, as an example, that they trade. They're a trading bloc to take on the powerful forces in the world, and where individual states can no longer do that individually, separately. They have to unite, and they've done that, and there are all sorts of trade agreements, trading blocs around the world, and but there is this competition for hegemony, for control of the world, and there is, you know, extreme. The effect of that is extreme in many cases, to the extent of war.
Critics of the United Kingdom and America claim that those countries have blood on their hands on account of the actions that they've taken. We asked the public to share their view on which actions have been most instrumental in generating that reputation. A lot of critics abroad have accused Britain and the United States in particular of having blood on their hands. Which recent interventions do you think have been most responsible for that impression?
Well, the war in Iraq. I think that was completely unjustified, and I think that did massive damage to Britain and America's sort of claims to any kind of global world order or kind of moral high ground. And I think, especially in Ukraine at the moment, can't help but see that, you know, Russia hasn't got any. Britain and America doesn't have a leg to stand on when it comes to what's happening in Ukraine as a result of Iraq.
Quite obviously to go to war in Iraq when we thought they had nuclear weapons, but there's no evidence of that, and whether or not, and there's no evidence found of that either. I mean, you do have to question what the real underlying motives were to go to war into places like that. Is it really to help civilians, or is it oil, or something else we don't even know about really? And I think we as the British public know a very small percentage of what actually goes on and why these decisions are made, and the media portrays the decisions in a certain way, and when we're fed information that we're led to believe, whether that's true or not, well, who knows really.
Around the world, Britain and America's critics have accused those countries of having quite a lot of blood on their hands. Yes. What would you say were the main triggers, the main actions by those countries to have caused that reputation to develop recently?
I think an inability to articulate really clearly what it is they're going to war for, and a lack of transparency. I think often there have been legitimate reasons, but a lack of transparency of that has led to cynicism about what those leaders are doing and what decisions they're making.
Have there been trigger-happy moments which have caused this reputation of the West having blood on its hands? Here's the view of our experts.
When we got involved in the war in Afghanistan, when we got involved in the war in Iraq, the bombing of Libya, when we get involved in NATO expansionism around the world, it doesn't mean people love us and revere us. It means that people say Britain is a poodle of the United States on these issues and ought to have its own much more independent foreign policy. And I think that many people, particularly after the start of the Afghan and Iraq wars, are very sceptical of Britain's global intentions. And I've noticed this personally whenever I've been visiting countries, particularly in the Middle East, just the view ordinary people have of Britain and its role in the war on terror that George Bush started in 2001.
What are the reasons the public have heard for military action? Do they believe those reasons? And if not, what do they think really underlines that military activity? Here's what they said. What reasons do you hear as justification for Britain taking military action? Do you believe those reasons? And if not, what do you think the real reasons tend to be?
Well, I think on the whole, the use of force, well, primarily since the end of the Cold War, I think the use of force has primarily revolved around international institutions and sort of multilateral engagement, so peacekeeping and that kind of thing. And I think on the whole, the use of force, well, not necessarily the use of force, but the use of military machinery and men has ultimately been to try and maintain order. I think at times we've got that very wrong, but I think the ways we've got it wrong mainly are the technique, not necessarily the underlying reasons. I think on the whole, Britain's use of force has been for honourable reasons, although at times we've got it wrong in how we've gone about it.
I don't believe them, but I don't know whether... I think there are other reasons behind it, like bureaucratic reasons, but the government will never admit to that. So.
What reasons do you hear as justification for taking military action? And do you actually believe them, or do you think there are different reasons underlying it all?
I don't think we get many reasons, to be honest. Or there's a lot of mystery behind it, or rumours as to why. You never really get the complete truth. I don't feel like we do anyway.
How plausible are the reasons given for military action? Here's the view of our experts.
British military action has often been accompanied with some vague view that British interests are at stake, and so two major incidents that have happened since the end of the Second World War. One was the promotion of a coup in Iran in 1952, because there was a nationalist government there that wanted to quite reasonably nationalise the oil industry. That government was removed in a coup sponsored by Britain and the United States in order to usher in the Shah and make vast profits for BP. The reality was British interests were not at stake. It was the profits of BP, which happened to be a British-based multinational, that were at stake more than anything else. Likewise, the joint British and French operation in Suez in 1956 was because the then government of Egypt, led by Colonel Nasser, wanted to, and did in fact, nationalise the Suez Canal. And in nationalising the Suez Canal, which was partly British owned, it was seen that British interests were at stake. There's a confusion there between British interests and the interests of very wealthy people in Britain. More recently, we've had the doctrine of humanitarian intervention put forward by Tony Blair in his Chicago speech. Now, the Chicago speech was very interesting because essentially it was a declaration of a moral superiority of the Atlantic Alliance over the rest of the world and the right to intervene for humanitarian reasons. The UN Charter does allow military intervention under Chapter 7 of the Charter. Nevertheless, the Iraq War went ahead without any specific UN approval of it. We went ahead on the basis of dishonesty, deception, and information that would prove to be wholly wrong about alleged weapons of mass destruction. So we went into a war that's cost billions and killed hundreds of thousands of people. And I think we should grow up and realise that our job is not to intervene militarily around the world. Our job is to be part of a responsible community of nations that do promote real security, that is the security from hunger, real security, the security from disaster and flooding, and mutual support when those kind of things happen, rather than spending all these billions on weapons of mass destruction.
The Holy Grail is saving the world for democracy. Well, thank you very much, but I don't want to be saved for your democracy. It's not my sense of democracy. Democracy is allowing people to take control of their lives, to create an environment where this can happen. And then simply, saying, well, it's your hospital, run it the way you want. Here's a budget, we're no longer going to spend billions, trillions on these super weapons, which will be used. It's not a fail-safe. I mean, they will be used ultimately at some point. And, just convert all that expenditure into supporting social well-being of people, schools, housing, hospitals, transport, public transport. This is what we need, and this is actually what people want.
Legally speaking, war can be a messy business. To what extent do leaders like Tony Blair and David Cameron respect the rule of international law and institutions such as the United Nations? Here's what they said. Do you think leaders like Tony Blair and David Cameron respect the rule of international law and respect the power and authority of institutions like the United Nations?
No.
Why not? You're quite sure about that?
Yeah, I'm very sure about that. I didn't really have a sort of left-wing background, but I would go as far as saying that when people say that Tony Blair is a war criminal, there's some justification in that view, and I certainly think he has blood on his hands. I think Parliament's done a pretty good job recently of resisting military interventions, so I think there is perhaps some hope for progress, but overall, British foreign policy in that respect has not been great in the last 10 years.
When it suits them, to a certain extent, they probably do respect them and But if they want to invade or they want to go to various places and get oil and the rest of it, they'll do what they please, really, I think.
It's not very good, is it?
No, it's not really, but it's the society we live in. It's supposed to be a democratic society, but in fact what happens is what the people in power want.
Yeah, they might say they do, but let's be serious here. Like, Tony Blair doesn't respect anyone, but his pocket, like, it's a guy, he took us to an illegal war, and then a few years later down the line, he's got a nice fancy job. Like, no one's held him or Bush accountable for any of their actions, and for them it's like, you know, yeah, we committed a few thousand war crimes and blah-de-blah-de-blah, we retire, and, you know, because we were, like, you know, ex-leaders, no one's gonna, like, come knocking at our door and prosecute us for anything. But then again, you look at guys like Mugabe, and then you look at guys like Blair and Bush, and even though they call Mugabe a tyrant, which he is, what's the difference? You're just in the Western world. That's the only difference, and you're sitting from a nice comfy seat where you can basically, like, stick a label at anyone and the media, like, will go along with it because there's a certain element of control that they have.
What does the record tell us of the extent to which British leaders have respected international law and international institutions, or simply ignored them? Here's what our expert said.
The leaders of all countries are very selective about the use of international law. International law within the UN Charter is quite clear that one sovereign nation cannot invade another, and it can only act in self-defense. There was no self-defense in the case of Iraq. It was an illegal invasion by a group of international powers led by the USA and strongly supported by Britain. There are also a number of international conventions, such as the 1951 Geneva Convention for Refugees, such as the conventions on torture, such as conventions on the rights of the child. Britain has signed every single one of the UN conventions. Unfortunately, Tony Blair wanted to deport numbers of people to various North African countries under immigration law because he believed them to be not their presence in Britain not to be conducive to the public good. They couldn't be deported because those countries had not signed the Convention on Torture, and the receiving country was therefore unable to guarantee that torture would not be administered towards them. So they were not deported. He then went and made a series of one-off agreements with a number of countries under which people have been deported even though there is no convention of protection. That has been challenged legally. So there are quite serious issues of the way in which Western countries, when it suits them, undermine the principles of international law. I fully support the International Criminal Court. I supported it being introduced in Parliament and the terms of the Rome Convention. But something seems slightly odd to me, that the ICC has been used against Milosevic for what happened in Yugoslavia, has been used in the case of Rwanda, and has been used in a number of other cases such as Bemba in the DRC. It's never been used against an American or European politician for promoting illegal wars around the world. And I think to restore its credibility, it should also take action where any leader is involved in an illegal invasion of another country.
What is the United Nations? What are these courts of justice around the world, trying this person for genocide or that person? You know, the people who are guilty of genocide are the Blairs, are the Bushes and the Kissingers and the, you know, Obama. I mean, these people are killers, only they don't call themselves. They're fighters for democracy, but they're not.
And then there's the question of investment, of time, of energy, of money, and whether the public would prefer to see that going into things such as the economy, National Health Service and crime reduction, or whether they'd prefer that investment to be directed towards further military interventions. Here's what they said. Which would you prefer? More time, energy and money to be spent on the economy, the NHS and crime reduction, or on further military interventions?
Definitely think the former. I think we need to invest heavily in our NHS, our education system as well. I think we need to sort of prioritise domestic improvements and reform over military spending.
I don't have a problem with foreign military intervention, but if it was done correctly. if they were going to help like the innocent victims, then yeah, but if there's ulterior motives, then no. I think it should be better spent on the country, put it into education, stop making us have to pay student loans.
There should be more investment in education, because basically when people have education, there will be crime reduction and the economy will go well, so everything will be in place. It's just the education. When people are educated, everything else will come up.
So the answer seems obvious to the public, if not necessarily to politicians. Why is it that there's such a strong preference towards that kind of expenditure and away from military expenditure, but still the money keeps getting pumped into military interventions? Here's what our expert said.
Britain is going to be faced with a major decision in 2016, whether or not to renew the Trident nuclear missile system. And if it decides to go ahead with that renewal, it will cost £100 billion over 25 years. And so that is between £3 and £4 billion per year for the next quarter of a century. It won't make us safe, it won't make us secure, it won't create many jobs, it will create an awful lot of misery in other areas of the economy. That money would be much better spent on healthcare, on education, on social services, and all the things that are desperately needed. Britain is the fourth biggest arms spender in the world. The USA totals half of all world military expenditure. It's a tiny proportion of that figure spent instead on dealing with the AIDS pandemic and dealing with the sanitation crisis in the poorest countries in the world would make the world an infinitely better place. We spend far too much on armaments, as do a number of other countries, and what we need to get our head around is the concept of real security. Real security is security from hunger, security from lacking health care. And I think that's the priorities that we should be developing, not just in this country, but all around the world.
What we hear from our politicians is seething with demagogic responses. They'll say one thing, but actually all their actions are in another direction. We need a government in our interests, and we don't have that. We need people who are honest. And when someone says, like, Gove, you know, he's defending education, or they're defending, the government's defending, and all Labour, Tory governments, defending the National Health Service, it's unmitigated demagogy. They're lying. That's not what they're doing. They're seeking ways to make it acceptable for people, because they're ultimately afraid of all of us, make it acceptable so that they can do certain things.
Britain's military interventions have cost time, money, and a vast number of innocent lives from around the world, and indeed from Britain itself. By definition, making war is a deadly practice, and one which has left a bloody stain on the pages of history right up to the present day. So it's time to stop and think. This programme can ask the questions, but it is for our politicians to provide more plausible and, we suggest, less deadly answers.